August Spitzer, died while in the mountain camps. James Smith, died while in the mountain camps. Samuel Shoemaker, Bayless Williams, died while in the mountain camps, and Eliza Williams, his sister. Mrs. Wolfinger, widow. Antonio, a Mexican, and Louis and Salvador, the two Indians sent with Stanton by General Sutter. Stated in brief, the result of the disaster to the party in the mountains was as follows. The total number of deaths was 36, as follows: 14 in the mountains while en route to the settlement, 14 at camp near Donner Lake, and 8 at Donner's Camp. The total number who reached the settlement was 45, of whom 5 were men, 8 were women, and 32 were children. The family of James F. Reed and that of Patrick Breen survived in unbroken numbers. The only other family in which all the children reached the settlement was that of Captain George Donner. 14 of the 81 souls constituting the Donner Party were boys and girls between the ages of 19 and 12 years. 26 ranged from 12 years to a year and a half, and 7 were nursing babes. There were only 34 adults, 22 men and 12 women. Of the first named group, 11 survived the disaster. 1 youth died en route with the Forlorn Hope, 1 at the lake camp, and 1 at Bear Valley in charge of the First Relief. 20 of the second named group also reached the settlements. 1 died en route with the First Relief, 2 at Donner's Camp in March 1847, 2 at Starved Camp in charge of the Second Relief, and 1 at the Lake Camp in March. 2 of the 7 babes lived, and 5 perished at the Lake Camp. They hungered and slowly perished after famine had dried the natural flow, and infant lips had drawn blood from maternal breasts. The first nursling's life to ebb was that of Louis Keseberg, Jr., on January 24, 1847. Footnote 21. Report brought by John Baptiste to Donner's Camp after one of his trips to the lake. His grief-stricken mother could not be comforted. She hugged his wasted form to her heart and carried it far from camp, where she dug a grave and buried it in the snow. Harriet McCutcheon, whose mother had struggled on with the Forlorn Hope in search of succor, breathed her last on the 2nd of February while lying upon the lap of Mrs. Graves. And the snow being deep and hard frozen, Mrs. Graves bade her son William make the necessary excavation near the wall within their cabin, and they buried the body there, where the mother should find it upon her return. Catherine Pike died in the Murphy cabin a few hours before the arrival of food from the settlement, and was buried on the morning of February 22nd. Footnote 22. Incident related by William C. Graves after he reached the settlement. Those were the only babes that perished before relief came. Does not the fact that so many young children survived the disaster refute the charges of parental selfishness and inhumanity, and emphasize the immeasurable self-sacrifice, love, and care that kept so many of the little ones alive through that long, bitter siege of starvation? Mrs. Eleanor Eddy, who passed away in the Murphy cabin on the 7th of February, was the only wife and mother called by death in either camp before the arrival of the First Relief. Both Patrick Breen's diary and William G. Murphy, then a lad of 11 years, assert that Mrs. Eddy and little Margaret, her only daughter, were buried in the snow near the Murphy cabin on the 9th of February. Furthermore, the Breen diary and the death list of the Donner Party show that not a husband or father died at the lake camp during the entire period of the party's imprisonment in the mountains. Footnote 23. Franklin W. Graves and J. Fosdick perished in December 1846 while en route to the settlement with the Forlorn Hope. How, then, could that First Relief, or either of the other relief parties, see? How could they even have imagined that they saw wife sitting at the side of her husband who had just died, mutilating his body, or daughter eating her father, or mother that of her children, or children that of father and mother? The same questions might be asked regarding the other revolting scenes pictured by the star. The 7 men who first braved the dangers of the icy trail in the work of rescue came over a trackless, ragged waste of snow, varying from 10 to 40 feet in depth, and approached the campsite near the lake at sunset. Footnote 24. One of the stumps near the Breen Graves cabin, cut for fuel while the snow was deepest, was found by actual measurement to be 22 feet in height. It is still standing. They hallooed, and up the snow steps came those able to drag themselves to the surface. When they descended into those cabins, they found no cheering lights. Through the smoky atmosphere they saw smoldering fires, and faced conditions so appalling that words forsook them. Their very souls were racked with agonizing sympathy. There were the famine-stricken and the perishing, almost as wasted and helpless as those whose sufferings had ceased. Too weak to show rejoicing, they could only beg with quivering lips and trembling hands, "Oh, give us something to eat, give us something to drink. We are starving." True, their hands were grimy, their clothing tattered, and the floors were bestrewn with hair from hides and bits of broken bullock bones, but of connubial, parental, or filial inhumanity there were no signs. With what deep emotion those 7 heroic men contemplated the conditions in camp may be gathered from Mr. Aguila Glover's own notes, published in Thornton's work. Quote, February 19, 1847. The unhappy survivors were, in short, in a condition most deplorable, and beyond power of language to describe, or imagination to conceive. The emigrants had not yet commenced eating the dead. Many of the sufferers had been living on bullock hides for weeks, and even that sort of food was so nearly exhausted that they were about to dig up from the snow the bodies of their companions for the purpose of prolonging their wretched lives. End quote. Thornton's work contains the following statement by a member of one of the Relief Corps. Quote, "On the morning of February 20th," footnote 25, Thornton's dates are 1 day later than those in the Breen diary. Breen must have lost a day en route. Racine Tucker, John Rhodes, and Riley Moutry went to the camp of George Donner, 8 miles distant, taking a little jerked beef. These sufferers, 18, had but 1 hide remaining. They had determined that upon consuming this they would dig from the snow the bodies of those who had died from starvation. Mr. Donner was helpless. Mrs. Donner was weak but in good health, and might have come to the settlement with this party. Yet she solemnly but calmly determined to remain with her husband and perform for him the last sad offices of affection and humanity. And this she did, in full view that she must necessarily perish by remaining behind. The 3 men returned the same day with 7 refugees from Donner Camp. End quote. Footnote 26. The 1st Relief Corps took 6 instead of 7 refugees from Donner Camp, and set out from the lake cabins with 23 instead of 24 refugees. John Baptiste Troubaud has distinct recollections of the arrival and departure of Tucker's party, and of the amount of food left by it. He said to me in that connection, quote, "To each of us who had to stay in camp, one of the First Relief Party measured a teacupful of flour, 2 small biscuits, and thin pieces of jerked beef, each piece as long as his first finger, and as many pieces as he could encircle with that first finger and thumb brought together, end to end. This was all that could be spared, and was to last until the next party could reach us. Our outlook was dreary and often hopeless. I don't know what I would have done sometimes without the comforting talks and prayers of those 2 women, your mother and Aunt Elizabeth. Then evenings after you children went to sleep, Mrs. George Donner would read to me from the book she wrote in every day. If that book had been saved, everyone would know the truth of what went on in camp, and not spread these false tales. I dug in the snow for the dead cattle, but found none, and we had to go back to our saltless old bullock hide, days before the 2nd Relief got to us on the 1st of March. End quote. Footnote 27. The journal herbarium, manuscript, and drawings of Mrs. George Donner were not